Hi, welcome to Level 1 Learn to Sail at the Royal New Zealand Yacht Squadron in Module 1. This is a great place to start this video series, and we're going to cover wet safety and weather. We really want to keep everyone safe while we're during the course. We've banned accidents. We're not allowed to have accidents anymore. One of the reasons we don't have accidents, I think, is that we're going to talk about those hazards. We're going to make sure everybody knows what the hazards are and how we mitigate those hazards and make sure they don't happen. I think in the last 5 years that I've been working here, I've used the first aid kit, I don't know, maybe 3 times. 2 bee stings and one person fell over on the dock and cut their knee, I think, before we went sailing. So we have a really good safety record, and I'm really proud of that, and we want to keep that going. One of the most important things is communication. So we can see from this picture that the guy here hanging onto that boom is probably doing that because the person on the helm didn't communicate very well. So we need to communicate really well, and everybody on the boat needs to have a good understanding of what's going to happen next and the safety implications of that and how to avoid hanging onto the end of the boom. With the water, we obviously need to be careful about that as well. And, someone drowning on a course is really bad for my career. So we're not allowed to do that either. Everybody's going to wear a life jacket. Now in New Zealand, on boats that are over 6 meters long, life jackets need to be available to everybody on board, but it's the skipper's discretion as to whether they're worn or not. Here on this course, everybody's going to wear a life jacket, including the coaches, and I just sleep better at night knowing that everybody's got a life jacket on board, wearing a life jacket, not just having a life jacket on board the boat. This help posture, should you find yourself in the water, that will keep you a bit warmer. We actually lose quite a lot of heat from swimming, and just relaxing in your life jacket and giving yourself a big hug, waiting for the boat to come back and pick you up is probably the best way for you to keep warm. We don't really need to worry too much about it though, because in Auckland, the water temperature is between 16 and 20 degrees all year round. So it's not that cold in the sea. But if you're sailing in more colder climates, then yeah, definitely that help posture will be quite a lifesaver. Yeah, communication, as we've already talked about, we need to tell everybody on board what we're going to do. So if we're turning the boat, we don't want to turn the boat and keep that a secret. We want to tell everybody that we're going to turn and warn them that the boom might be changing size. Keep a 360-degree watch. Well, we want to avoid other boats. We also want to avoid obstacles. So obstacles might be at the bridge, it might be shallow water, it might be rocks. But those other boats, they come at us from all angles. And there's some people out there that haven't had any education at all. They don't know the rules. They're not necessarily in control of their vessel. So if you see any vessels, or even you think we're getting a bit too close to the bridge, let your coach know. They may not have seen that danger. Keep a straight course though. Don't change course until the coach tells you what to do. It might be that we are the right-of-way vessel. Don't really use right-of-way in sailing. The term is stand on, but it might be the other vessel that has to give way. So if we're the stand-on vessel and the other boat is the give-way vessel, if we start trying to give way to them, that's just going to confuse the whole thing. So keep going straight. Let the coach know that there's a potential problem, and the coach will decide what the best course of action for us to do is, and then you just follow the instructions from there. Now, sometimes people are a bit worried about the boat going upside down. On the right-hand side of the picture, you see that the boat has a keel. Now, that's made out of lead, and it's really heavy, and it keeps the boat upright. Yeah, like the picture, the boat might heel a bit, tip. Now, that's quite common to have a little bit of water coming over the side of the boat at times. That's all perfectly normal. The boat will heel as the wind interacts with the sail, and it's okay. The keel will stop us from going upside down, and once you get used to the motion of the boat, it's fine. On this level 1 course, our first day out will be very calm and very much under control. And if you are concerned about the boat tipping or heeling, then just let your coach know, and we can show you how we can control how much the boat heels and how much control we have over it, because we do actually have complete control over how much the boat heels. We don't have to. That keel will do a really good job of keeping the boat upright. The other hazards on the boat are ropes. So ropes, when we stand on them, tend to roll, and a bit like standing on marbles. They pull around our feet and trip us over. We need to be careful about the ropes. Winches, well, the hand on the top right-hand picture is just a little bit too close to that winch. We want to keep our fingers out of the winch, and that hand could still pull on the rope if it was half a metre away from the winch. So we can still operate the winch without our fingers really close to it. On the bottom picture there, Annalise, the coach, is pointing to the boom. That's that metal pole underneath the main sail. And as you can see, she's not very tall, and the boom is not going to be a problem for her if she's standing up. But those other ladies, they were actually quite tall, and if they stood up, the boom would hit them if it was to change sides. So we want to keep below some center of gravity, yes, when we're moving around. We only want to turn the boat when everybody is aware that we're going to turn the boat. So turning the boat is when the boom might switch sides. And if everybody knows they might need to duck, then no one's going to get hit with the boom. And if you're driving, you can keep going straight until everybody's ready and prepared to duck underneath the boom. We don't really want to be having any head injuries from hitting people with the boom. The other thing we need to talk about is Ophir, the leopard seal. Now, we do have a full-size leopard seal that lives in Westhaven Marina. I think that that's an amazing privilege to share the marina with her, but she is a large animal. That fender, that white thing that she's playing with, is about 1.2 meters long. So you can see that she is about 2 meters long. She's a big girl. It's a beautiful, majestic creature that should be in Antarctica playing with penguins, but she chooses to live here in Auckland. She does move around the marinas in Auckland a bit. Basically, she eats the fish in Westhaven, and when there's nothing to eat, she goes somewhere else. If we see her, we'll definitely take some pictures, but we don't want to be going over to her, giving her a stroke or trying to feed her or anything done like that. We'll keep away from her. We'll respect her as a large animal. But yeah, hopefully we will see her and we'll be able to get some good photos of her. She's really quite a special creature. She's never done any harm to anybody. She does do a bit of damage to boats in the marina with pulling things off them and playing with them, but it's pretty cool to see her. Okay, let's have a look at the weather. Now, the weather plays a huge part in safety on the boat. The sun, obviously in New Zealand, that we need to be careful about the sun. Doesn't matter what you're doing in New Zealand. If it's sunny day, you could get sunburn. When we're sailing, there's also a reflection off the sea that we need to consider as well. So you kind of get burnt twice when we're out sailing. Water bottles are a great idea. If you're feeling that you've got a headache coming on, it might be that you're dehydrated. So having a water bottle is a good idea. Getting cold and wet, having multiple layers, having a waterproof jacket that you can put on. There's plenty of space on the boat for you to take extra layers of clothing if you want to have extra stuff just in case you get cold. Strong winds. Now, nothing wrong with sailing in strong winds, but we need to be prepared for that. This grid at the bottom of the slide now shows us some wind strengths and what problems we may have with those wind strengths. So 0 to 5 knots, it's very difficult to feel where the wind is coming from, and therefore it's hard to know where to position the sails. This also can be a little bit boring because there's not much speed. As you get to know sailing better, it can be quite a challenge to sail in light winds. I know certainly a number of sailors that really like sailing in no winds because they're really good at it and they can win races because and they even have a sixth sense of where the wind's going to be. But a bit of a challenge for when we're starting out, though. 5 to 15 knots is kind of everybody's favourite wind speed. It's easy to tell which way the wind's coming from. We can feel it on our face. We can see the effect on the water. We've got some speed. There's some acceleration. It can be quite fun. When we get to 15 to 25 knots, well, that's more fun. There's more speed, more acceleration, a little bit less comfort. Yeah, a little bit splashy perhaps. As the power increases, though, when the wind gets over 25 knots, well, that's when it becomes quite difficult again. We're trying to manage the power that the boat is developing with the sails. And over 25 knots tends to be where people get hurt when we break bits, things on the boat. So probably over 25 knots is not where we should start sailing. Something that you need to get experience in and build up your comfort, but also your skill level in controlling the boat in those stronger breeze. If you're wondering what a knot is, well, 1 knot is 1.852 kilometers per hour. I can't do that maths in my head, and I don't expect you to. Just multiply or divide by 2. So if you see on the television that the wind is going to be 50 kilometers an hour, if we divide that by 2, you'll find that we're going to have 25 knots. So once we've finished looking at a cool boat, we'll move on to weather forecasts. Really important to have as much information as we can before we go sailing. The TV weather forecast is just not good enough. It's not a marine forecast. It's great to know if we want to take an umbrella to work with us. But in terms of how strong the wind's going to be, whether the sea state is suitable for us to go sailing, we need a marine forecast for that. When we're out sailing on VHF channel 19, we can get a weather forecast there. We can also hear what's called nowcasting, and that's the live weather stationed around the Hauraki Gulf all report their weather information that's happening right now, and they broadcast that over channel 19. So we can find out what the weather is actually doing now in different locations around the Hauraki Gulf, and we can compare that to our weather forecasts, see how good our weather forecast is. Most common place to get weather forecasts nowadays is obviously the internet and apps in particular. Let's have a look at those. I really like the Coast Guard app. It's $3 or $4 donation to the New Zealand Coast Guard, which I think is a really worthy cause. It's a really useful app. You see that when I took this screenshot, the peak wind was 17 knots, so the gusts were 17 knots. The average wind was 13 knots, so quite a nice day to go sailing. And the compass heading for where the wind was coming from is 163 degrees. Just on the bottom of that page there, you can see when the high and the low tide will be, and also the heights of those tides. There's a lot of useful information there. And if we touch this little circle here, we can change from Bean Rock, which is the lighthouse in the middle of the harbour. We could change to a different weather station. So if we were sailing from here to Kowau, we could change that to Tiri Island just off the coast of Whangaparoa, and we could see what the weather is there, and that would be really useful to know what we were sailing into. Okay, so that's nowcasting. The official marine forecast is Met Service, so that's the official New Zealand weather forecast. I find that app a little bit clunky to deal with, and I prefer other apps to use, but you might like this app though. It's worth having a look at. It is the official one, so there's really good information there. Like I say, I just find it a little clunky. The apps I prefer to use is Windy and Predict Wind. So this is Windy here. It's very graphical, just arrows. If they're big arrows, if they're lots of arrows, if they're dark red, then it's really windy. If there's a few arrows that are blue, light blue, then it's not very windy. Green arrows is what we want to see. So you can see on this where all the numbers are, you can see that there's quite a large part of that day that's got lots of green. And green for go, really, that's that 15 knot sort of zone in terms of wind strength. So that's a good day to go sailing. We've got predict wind there. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. That's one of our sponsors at the club, and they have quite a good app that's got quite a lot of features. The other website that I really liked using was Wind Guru. Now, there is a lot of numbers on it, which takes a little bit of interpretation. So these are wind speeds, and then we've got wind directions, and then there's tide heights and stuff as well. The information here I found was quite accurate. It was a good forecasting model. It just took a little bit of time to understand what all the numbers meant. I much prefer graphical representation like this on Windy. Let's have a look at predict wind a bit more. So one of the key features of predict wind is that there are multiple models of forecasting the wind. If they all producing similar numbers, then probably that weather forecast is going to be accurate. Most weather forecasts are not accurate. You know, they're kind of always wrong. Maybe the weather is going to come earlier or later in the day. It's really difficult to predict when. They are getting better. Having multiple algorithms that the computer is using to predict the wind gives us a little bit of comfort that when we see all the numbers being very similar, that the forecast is going to be pretty good. Now, there are graphical versions of this information as well. So just like a Windy, you can represent this on a chart of Auckland with arrows and colours and things. So we've got that really quick, easily accessible graphical nature as well. It does have all the numbers. And one of the other things is that there's a lot more now casting weather stations on predict wind. So one of them is actually on our start boat. Actually, all of our vessels have wind gear on there from predict wind. So if you're lining up on one of our start lines, you can actually find the start boat on predict wind, and you can find out what the start boat of our race is recording in terms of weather, you know, right at the time that you're starting the race. So it's quite a useful app. Very pleased to have them as sponsors of the club. We also have the tide times and heights at the bottom of the page. Really useful app. There is a free version and a paid version of that. So one of the best ways of getting the weather forecast is to look out the window. And if we see this photograph here, we've got a load of seagulls sitting on posts. Which way do you think the wind's blowing? It's quite interesting that seagulls always park themselves facing into wind. So just from looking at that photograph, because I have a small amount of knowledge about seagulls, which is, I don't know, maybe a bit weird, but seagulls like to look into the wind. It gives them a better chance of taking off, increases their wind speed for when they take off. And if you open a bag of chips, they'll be straight onto you if they're facing into wind. If they're facing downwind, they'll find it a little bit harder to take off. So seagulls always tend to look into wind. Now, we're not going to be sailing anywhere near those seagulls because we don't want to hit those posts. So that's something for you to observe before you go sailing. There are some other things, though, that we might observe when we're sailing that would help us. Here we have the flags on the harbour bridge, and we can see the wind direction from the flags. So the post is first, and the flag is blown downwind. So post, wind is blowing across the flags. So there's the arrows for where the wind, that I believe the wind angle is. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult to get the perspective on the flag to see which way it's actually blowing, certainly from a distance. But the flags are quite useful because they can also tell us a bit more. So we can see that on the left-hand picture, the flag is a bit droopy, and that's because it's light wind. There's not enough wind to make it fly really well, and I would suggest that is about 5 knots, maybe a little less. on the picture on the right, well, the flags are flying really well, and the wind is more than 5 knots there, probably about 8 to 10 knots. The flagpoles aren't bending, so it's not really, really windy, but the flags are flying quite nicely. There's enough wind to make them fly really well, and I think that probably happens about 8 to 10 knots. Here we've got a nice photograph taken from outside the club, looking across towards the Navy base at Devonport. And there's a few things that we can see here. There's a darker area of water, so kind of in the middle of the photograph. And then close to the photographer, the water looks a bit shiny. And that's because there's more wind where it's darker. So the wind tends to travel, the waves travel downwind. So if we roughly draw a line where I think the waves are coming from Devonport towards the photographer. So down the page, that's the direction of the wind. The wind is forming the waves, blowing them downwind. Over where the water is a bit darker, I feel that it's about 12 knots there. The reason why I think it's 12 knots is because we're getting white caps. There's only a few white caps, and the white caps tend to be formed when it's 12 knots. So at 12 knots of wind speed, white caps start to form, and that's just the back of the wave getting blown off. Where it's a bit shiny, it's a bit less than 12 knots. I would say about 8 to 10 knots. There's a few small waves, so there's definitely some wind, but there's not much in the way of, well, there isn't really any white caps there. Now, why this is important is because if you think of a racing situation, I want to go as fast as I can. The boat's going to be faster in that area of darker water where it's 12 knots. So if you were watching the America's Cup and you were wondering what the commentators were talking about, whether they were going one side of the course or the other because there was more wind there, and thinking, well, how the hell are they working that out? This is it. It's not rocket science. It's just a patch of darker water. There's more waves there. The sea is less reflective, so it looks darker. We can't see the air moving, but we can see the effect it has on the water. And that's what we're looking at when we're sailing. We're looking for dark patches of water because we want to sail where there's more wind because the boat's faster. It could be, though, if we're out cruising and we want to have a smoother time, that we don't want to sail where the dark water is. Maybe we want to sail where the lighter wind is and give our crew an easier, smoother ride. So we do have some choices. Making some observations about what's happening right now on the surface of the water will help us make some good decisions, irrespective of what sort of sailing we're doing. Here's a nice picture of Kowal. This is actually, if you come on the level 2 cruising course, this is the view that you wake up to from Lidgard House. And if we have a look at that photo, you can see that there's definitely no white caps, so it's light wind day. But which way is the wind blowing? Well, I think the wind is blowing straight on the nose of that boat there that's anchored. And I think it's about 5 knots. Certainly very light wind. And most of the wind is in the main Donegal harbour. Coming around the corner into Smelting House Bay, there's not much wind there. You can see that it's quite shiny and there's nothing. It starts off with a few big waves, or bigger waves anyway, and then they sort of peter out and go to nothing. So around the corner here in Smelting House Bay, there's nothing. Out in the main drag of Donegal Harbour, there's maybe 5 knots of wind. One thing to note when we're looking at wind direction by which way the boat's pointing is that the tide can affect the position of the boat as well. So I think on this particular day, the tide is coming in and it's the same direction as the wind, which is why that boat is pointing straight into the wind. If it was light wind and the tide was going out, well, that boat might be the other way around because the tide would affect the boat more than the wind. If it's really strong wind, it probably wouldn't matter which way the tide was going, the wind would have a bigger effect on the where the boat was positioned. Here's a nice photo of the return trip from Kawau. So we're heading south from Kawau towards Whangaparoa. And what can we see here? We can see that the waves are bigger. We can see that there are white caps. The white caps are longer. The white caps tend to grow in length as the wind strength increases, and there's lots of them. So there's lots of wind. It's more than 12 knots here because the white caps are bigger. There's more of them. That's more wind. The waves are bigger. Again, more wind. So I think that's probably about 18 knots. The gusts might be as much as 20, perhaps 25 knot gusts, but the average wind speed would probably be somewhere between 15 and 18, probably on the higher of that range, more like 18 wind. But that would be a nice, fast, fun sail back to Auckland. And the other thing we can see, of course, is the wind direction. So the waves go downwind, and the wind is coming across the screen like that. So the waves are moving. Move the cursor back. So downwind is that way. That's the way the wind's blowing. So you can see a lot. You can get a lot of information by looking at the water. We also have the wind pennant on top of the mast. That would help us figure out where the wind's coming from. But paying attention to what's actually happening and what's happening in nature, whether it's seagulls that are looking into wind, or whether it's the color of the water, how big the waves are, we can tell a lot from just studying the water. And that's what the America's Cup sailors are doing. And that's what the commentators are doing when they're trying to talk us through the race and tell us what's happening. So, well done. We've come to the end of Module 1. Have a go at the quiz. If you get on really well with that, just go on to Module 2. With the quiz, you should be able to see your results straight away and also be able to compare them to other people's results. It's all anonymous, so don't worry about that. But if you've got a good score, just move straight on to Module 2, and I'll see you there.